The legality of cannabis varies from country to country. Possession of cannabis is illegal in most countries and has been since the beginning of widespread cannabis prohibition in the late 1930s. However, possession of the drug in small quantities had been decriminalized in many countries and subnational entities in several parts of the world. Furthermore, possession is legal or effectively legal in the Netherlands, Uruguay and in the U.S. states of Colorado and Washington, as the federal government has indicated that it will not attempt to block enactment of legalization in those states. On December 10, 2013, Uruguay became the first nation in the world to legalize the sale, cultivation, and distribution of cannabis. The medicinal use of cannabis is legal in a number of countries, including Canada, the Czech Republic and Israel. While federal law in the United States bans all sale and possession of cannabis, enforcement varies widely at the state level and some states have established medicinal marijuana programs that contradict federal law. Colorado and Washington have repealed their laws prohibiting the recreational use of cannabis, and have instated a regulatory regime that is contrary to federal statutes. Some countries have laws that are not as vigorously prosecuted as others, but apart from the countries that offer access to medical marijuana, most countries have various penalties ranging from lenient to very severe. Some infractions are taken more seriously in some countries than others in regard to the cultivation, use, possession or transfer of cannabis for recreational use. A few jurisdictions have lessened penalties for possession of small quantities of cannabis, making it punishable by confiscation and a fine, rather than imprisonment. Some jurisdictions' drug courts use mandatory treatment programs for young or frequent users, with freedom from narcotic drugs as the goal, and a few jurisdictions permit cannabis use for medicinal purposes. Drug tests to detect cannabis are increasingly common in many countries and have resulted in jail sentences and loss of employment. However, simple possession can carry long jail sentences in some countries, particularly in parts of East Asia and Southeast Asia, where the sale of cannabis may lead to life imprisonment or even execution. Currently Bangladesh, North Korea, Czech Republic, Portugal, Uruguay, the Netherlands, and the United States have the least restrictive cannabis laws, while China, Indonesia, Japan, Sweden, Turkey, France, Singapore, Malaysia, South Korea, Philippines and the United Arab Emirates have the strictest cannabis laws. According to the first ever global study of illicit drug use, published in August 2013 by The Lancet Journal, marijuana is the most popularly used illegal drug worldwide. History. Cannabis has been in use for thousands of years. In India and Nepal, cannabis has long been used in religious rituals. Under the name cannabis, 19th-century medical practitioners sold the drug, popularizing the word among English speakers. In 1894, the report of the Indian Hemp Drugs Commission, commissioned by the UK Secretary of State and the Government of India, was instrumental in a decision not to decriminalize the drug in those countries. In further readings below. From the year 1860, different states in the U.S. started to implement regulations for sales of cannabis sativa. A 1905 bulletin from the U.S. Department of Agriculture lists 29 states with laws mentioning cannabis. In 1925, a change of the International Opium Convention banned exportation of Indian hemp to countries that have prohibited its use. Importing countries were required to issue certificates approving the importation, stating that the shipment was to be used exclusively for medical or scientific purposes. The Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 was the first U.S. national law making cannabis possession illegal, with the exception of industrial or medical purposes. Growers of hemp products were required to purchase an annual tax stamp, priced at $24, and retailers were required to purchase stamps priced at $1 per annum. The name marijuana is associated almost exclusively with the plant's psychoactive use. The term is now well known in English largely due to the efforts of American drug prohibitionists during the 1920s and 1930s. Mexico officially adopted prohibition in 1925, following the International Opium Convention. The use of cannabis became widespread in the Western world due to the rise and influence of the counterculture that began in the late 1960s. In the late 1990s in California, Dennis Peron started a movement to legalize medical cannabis. On November 6, 2012, Colorado Amendment 64 and Washington Initiative 502 were passed by popular initiative, thereby becoming the first American states to legalize the recreational use of cannabis under state law. However, cannabis is still classified as a Schedule I controlled substance under federal law and is subject to federal prosecution under the doctrine of dual sovereignty and supremacy clause. In a historical event with global significance, Colorado Governor John Hickenlooper signed 2 bills on May 28, 2013 that made Colorado the world's first fully regulated recreational cannabis market for adults. Hickenlooper said to the media, "Certainly, this industry will create jobs. Whether unregistered trademark is good for the brand of our state is still up in the air." But the voters passed Amendment 64 by a clear majority. For unregistered trademark why we unregistered trademark going to implement it as effectively as we possibly can. In its independent analysis, the Colorado Center on Law and Policy found that the state could expect it to see $60 million in total combined savings and additional revenue for Colorado unregistered trademark's budget, with a potential for this number to double after 2017. Uruguay then became the world's first nation to legalize the production, sale, and consumption of cannabis in December 2013 after a 16-13 vote in the Senate. Julio Calzada, Secretary General of Uruguay unregistered trademark's National Drug Council, said in a December 2013 interview that the government will be responsible for regulating the production side of the process. Companies can get a license to cultivate if they meet all the criteria. However, this won't unregistered trademark be a free market. The government will control the entire production and determine the price, quality, and maximum production volume. Under the new law, people are allowed to buy up to 40 grams of cannabis from the Uruguayan government each month. Users have to be 18 or older and be registered in a national database to track their consumption. Cultivators are allowed to grow up to 6 crops at their homes each year and shall not surpass 480 grams. Registered smoking clubs are allowed to grow 99 plants annually. Buying cannabis is prohibited to foreigners and it is illegal to move it across international borders. In July 2014, announced President Julio Calzada that the implementation of the law is postponed to 2015, there are practical difficulties, and that authorities will grow all the cannabis that can be sold legal. Concentration of THC shall be 15% or lower. An opposition presidential candidate claimed that the new law never is going to be applied, it is not workable. Alcohol and marijuana prohibition correlation. Franklin D. Roosevelt promised in the election for president to end the prohibition for alcohol. He fulfilled that promise in 1933. For cannabis, Roosevelt supported more restrictive laws from 1935. The U.S. Treasury Department created a new department in 1930 named the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Harry J. Anslinger, who previously held the position of Assistant Prohibition Commissioner, became the Commissioner of Narcotics in 1930. Commissioner Anslinger's report in 1935 noted, in the absence of federal legislation on the subject, the states and cities should rightfully assume the responsibility for providing vigorous measures for the extinction of this lethal weed, and it is therefore hoped that all public-spirited citizens will earnestly enlist in the movement urged by the Treasury Department to adjure intensified enforcement of marijuana laws. By 1937, 46 out of 48 states had officially classified cannabis as a narcotic along the lines of morphine, heroin, and cocaine. Anslinger, a unregistered trademark's campaign supported the passing of the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. The bill originated in the Harrison Narcotic Act of 1914, but that law didn't unregistered trademark actually ban marijuana outright. Attitudes regarding legalization. Many advocate legalization of cannabis, believing that it will eliminate the illegal trade and associated crime, yield a valuable tax source and reduce policing costs. Cannabis is now available as a palliative agent, in Canada, with a medical prescription. In 1969, only 16% of voters in the USA supported legalization, according to a poll by Gallup. According to the same source, that number had risen to 36% by 2005. More recent polling indicates that the number has risen even further. In 2009, between 46% and 56% of U.S. voters would support legalization. According to press reports, supporters of the California initiative estimate that about $15 billion worth of marijuana is sold every year in the state. Thus, an excise tax on the retail sales of marijuana could raise at least $1.3 billion a year in revenue. Attitudes regarding marijuana regulation have also changed as some states have passed their own laws legalizing marijuana for recreational use. According to a Gallup poll published in December 2012, 64% of Americans believe the federal government should not intervene in these states. The survey also found a difference in age groups for those that think marijuana should be legal and those that still support prohibition. 60% of 18 to 29-year-olds favor legalization while only 48% of those aged 30 to 64 and 36% of those older than 65 feel this way. In the Pew Research Center poll released on April 4, 2013, 52% support legalizing the drug and only 45% oppose legalization. While support has generally tracked upward over time, it has spiked 11 percentage points since 2010. Research conducted by the Pew Research Center in February 2014 shows an increase in the percentage of legalization supporters, from 52% to 54%. Advertising, medical marijuana advertisements have been banned in states where it has been legalized, although it is legal to advertise other pharmaceuticals. Use of capital punishment against the cannabis trade. Several countries have either carried out or legislated capital punishment for cannabis trafficking. Non-drug purposes. Hemp is the common name for cannabis and is the English term used when this annual herb is grown for non-drug purposes. These include industrial purposes for which cultivation licenses may be issued in the European Union. When grown for industrial purposes, hemp is often called industrial hemp, and a common product is fiber for use in a variety of different ways. Fuel is often a byproduct of hemp cultivation. Hemp seed may be used as food. Though the UK's DFRA will not issue cultivation licenses for this purpose, treating it as a non-food crop, the seed appears on the UK market as a food product. In the UK, hemp seed and fibre have always been perfectly legal products. Cultivation for non-drug purposes was, however, completely prohibited from 1928 until circa 1998, when Home Office industrial purpose licenses became available under the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971. Industrial strains intended for legal use within the EU are bred to comply with regulations limiting THC content to 0.2%. International reform. Cannabis reform at the international level refers to efforts to ease restrictions on cannabis use under international treaties. Internationally, the drug is in Schedule 4, the most restrictive category, of the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. As of January 1, 2005, 180 nations belong to the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. The Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs makes a distinction between recreational, medical and scientific uses of drugs. Nations are allowed to permit medical use of drugs, but recreational use is prohibited by Article 4. The parties shall take such legislative and administrative measures as may be necessary, subject to the provisions of this convention, to limit exclusively to medical and scientific purposes the production, manufacture, export, import, distribution of, trade in, use and possession of drugs. The Convention Against Illicit Traffic in Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances requires its parties to establish criminal penalties for possession of drugs prohibited under the Single Convention for recreational use. A nation wanting to legalize marijuana would have to withdraw from the treaties. Every signatory has a right to do this. Cannabis is in Class B of the United Kingdom's Misuse of Drugs Act 1971, for which a caution will usually be issued for a first offence, but further incidents may result in arrest. It was moved to the less stringent Class C in January 2004, but was returned to Class B in January 2009. The Netherlands has moved towards a more restrictive drug policy for cannabis. Barriers. Some barriers to cannabis reform are the result of the international drug control structure, while others are related to political circumstances. A number of non-government organizations support the prohibition of cannabis as a recreational drug. In 2013, 97 NGOs in 37 countries joined the World Federation Against Drugs. Bureaucratic, the international drug control system is overseen by the United Nations General Assembly and UN Economic and Social Council. The Single Convention grants the Commission on Narcotic Drugs the power to reschedule controlled substances. Cindy Fazy, the former chief of demand reduction for the United Nations Drug Control Program, said, "Theoretically, the conventions can be changed by modification, such as moving a drug from one schedule to another or simply by removing it from the schedules. However, this cannot be done with cannabis because it is embedded in the text of the 1961 convention. Also, modification would need a majority of the Commission's unregistered trademark 53 members to vote for it. Amendment to the conventions, that is changing an article or part of an article, does not offer a more promising route for the same reason. Even if a majority were gained, then only one state need ask for the decision to go to the Economic and Social Council for further consideration, and demand a vote. The 1971 and 1988 conventions need a two-thirds majority for change, not just a simple majority. To modify cannabis regulations at the international level, a conference to adopt amendments in accordance with Article 47 of the Single Convention would be needed. This has been done once, with the 1972 Protocol amending the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. As Fazy notes, this process is fraught with bureaucratic obstacles. Political, in reference to situations where the Commission on Narcotic Drugs proposes changing the scheduling of any drug, 21 U.S.C. A.A. millisecond 811, d. 2, b. of the U.S. Controlled Substances Act gives the Secretary of Health and Human Services the power to issue recommendations that are binding on the U.S. representative in international discussions and negotiations, whenever the Secretary of State receives information that the Commission on Narcotic Drugs of the United Nations proposes to decide whether to add a drug or other substance to one of the schedules of the Convention, transfer a drug or substance from one schedule to another, or delete it from the schedules. The Secretary of State shall transmit timely notice to the Secretary of Health and Human Services of such information, who shall publish a summary of such information in the Federal Register and provide opportunity to interested persons to submit to him comments respecting the recommendation which he is to furnish, pursuant to this subparagraph, respecting such proposal. The Secretary of Health and Human Services shall evaluate the proposal and furnish a recommendation to the Secretary of State which shall be binding on the representative of the United States in discussions and negotiations relating to the proposal. The U.S. Department of Justice Drug Enforcement Administration denied in June 2011 a petition that proposed rescheduling of cannabis and enclosed a long explanation for the denial. On March 5, 2013, the International Narcotics Control Board urged the United States government to challenge the legalization of marijuana for recreational use in Colorado and Washington. INCB President, Raymond Yan stated that these state laws violate international drug treaties, namely the United Nations Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs of 1961. The Office of the U.S. Attorney General said in December 2012 that regardless of any changes in state law, growing, selling or possessing any amount of marijuana remained illegal under federal law. Raymond Yans called the statement good but insufficient, and said he hoped that the issue would soon be addressed by the U.S. government in line with the international drug control treaties. See also: Adult lifetime cannabis used by country, annual cannabis used by country, cannabis and lobbying efforts, effects of cannabis, legal and medical status of cannabis, legal history of cannabis in the United States, legality of cannabis by country, Cannabis Social Club, 1946 Lake Success Protocol, illegal drug trade, Latin American drug legalization, references. Further reading: Reefer Madness, a 2003 book by Eric Schlosser, detailing the history of marijuana laws in the United States. The Emperor Wears No Clothes, a 1985 book by Jack Herer, The Authoritative Historical Record of Cannabis and the Conspiracy Against Marijuana. Fazy, Cindy, The Union Drug Policies and the Prospect for Change, April 2003. Feeney, Susan, Bush Backs States' Rights on Marijuana, The Dallas Morning News, October 20, 1999. Monthly Status of Treaty Adherence, January 1, 2005. Shamir, Ronan and Hacker Daphna, Colonialism's Civilizing Mission, The Case of the Indian Hemp Drug Commission, in Law and Social Inquiry 26, 2, 435-461, Wolfe, Daniel, Condemned to Death, Agents Global, April 8, 2004. Bush, Bill, An Anniversary to Regret, 40 Years of Failure of the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. External links, European Laws on Possession of Cannabis for Personal Use from EMCDDA, National Organisation for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, Australian Laws on Possession of Cannabis for Personal Use.